The French Chef is made possible by a grant from Hills Brothers Coffee Incorporated and a grant from the Polaroid Corporation.
They say it's very easy to pick out good steaks if you know all about meat cuts and bones and where they come from on the beef carcass. So I'm going to try and straighten this out on meat cuts when we make friends with the beef carcass today on the French Chef. Welcome to the French Chef. I'm Julia Child. I wonder if you're like me and get awfully confused about steak cuts. Well, I've decided I want to learn something about them, and it appears that the only way to learn something about them is to learn about the beef and where these cuts come from on the carcass. And my nice husband has made me a great big chart here, which he copied out of one of those meat books. And this is a picture of the beef rampant in the field, racing across the greensward. It's as though you looked at him with X-ray eyes. And this is where his head was. And then you see all of his bones down through here, and that's where his front foot. And then here's his soft underbelly, and there's the back foot. And here's where the tail used to be, and then here are all the bones. That's the backbone, and there's your great big hip bone, and there's more of the backbone. And the ribs and this great big shoulder bone and the arm. And these lines here, of course, they're not on the beef itself, but these make the separations of where these great big cuts are when the butcher buys the meat and then he cuts it up. And so all of these sections have a name like sirloin and loin. And these names are the same all over the country. It's just when they begin cutting up these sections that it makes a difference. And we're interested in steaks today. And the most expensive and almost the well-known steaks come from these two parts, the sirloin and the loin, which are right along the back here. And they're very expensive because they're the most tender, because the beef gets less exercise in that part. But you can get very good steaks from other parts of the carcass if you've got a good butcher and a good market. And we're going to concentrate on the shoulder or chuck, which is up here. And we're also going to do what I mean to say is we're going to do expensive steaks from the loin and half the price steaks that come from the shoulder or chuck. And this, as you see, it has the great big shoulder blade, which is just like yours, and then it has a big upper arm. And this arm, I've got the bone that it comes from. It's right here. You see, there's the bone here, and here's the bone there. And you are going to understand beef cuts much more if you identify the beef bones with your own bones, because this bone is just like your own arm, you see? That's where the hoof was, and up here is where it attaches onto your shoulder. So if you think of the beef's carcass like yours, then I think you'll understand much more. And this upper arm here, there's a great big piece of muscle that fits in there. I'm not sure exactly which way it fits. I think it fits just like that. And this whole piece can be cut into very good steaks. They just cut it right straight down like that, any thickness that you want. And here are some steaks that have been cut from that part. You see that there's an oval shape, and if you look at it very carefully, you see there's a great big eye of solid meat that runs all along there. And then as a complete identity, as well as it's being oval, you always find it has this little mark right here in the center that runs up through the center of it, and that's called a vein, or a piece. It's sort of like a piece of gristle. And this always identifies it. the best part of the arm steak is from the part that's nearest the shoulder. So this is, say, the first cut of it, and I've got here right underneath one of the last cuts of it. And this looks also as though it were almost as good, because it looks as though you had this big eye, but if you look closely, there's a separation there. So the eye is really only half as big, but even so you see the same vein running down through it. So if you just remember that vein here and this one here, you know this is an arm steak. But you want the arm steak from the upper half. So they may call this best steak in the house or something like that. But if you want an arm steak, no matter where you are, you say to your butcher, show on yourself. You say, I want a steak from the upper arm, and I want it cut from as near the shoulder as possible. So if you begin getting familiar with these cuts, you can always show on yourself where they are. And no matter where you move to, you can describe the kind of cut of meat that you want. So after you've selected your steak, you have to decide how to cook it. And of course, the most familiar way is to broil, and a very French way is to sauté. But we're going to do a combination of the two using a very thick steak, and we're going to do a combination of sauté and baking. But no matter how you're going to cook your steak, you're going to cook it over dry heat. You want to be sure that you dry the steak off, because if it's wet, you're not going to be able to brown it properly. So just remember that as your first step, no matter what kind of a steak you have. And this is a steak about 1.5 inches thick, and this method is a very good one for cooking it. And I'm going to brown it on both sides on top of the stove in a little bit of cooking oil. I always use a very light olive oil, just enough to film the pan. And then this has to get very hot. That's one of the things, and if you're going to brown or cook anything, you have to have your meat dry, and then you have to have your oil very hot indeed. And when it's almost smoking, which it almost seems to be doing, lay the steak in, and I always turn it on both sides so each side is covered with the oil, and then it has to brown on that one side, and then it'll brown on the other side. Now for this also, because you are going to cook it partly on the stove and partly in the oven, you want to have a flame-proof pan. The one that I'm using is enameled iron, and there are some flame-proof ceramics you can use, or if you have a great big frying pan, you can brown it in that and then stick it in the oven for the rest of the cooking. And now to get back again to the arm steak. If this is going to be good as a steak, you want to be sure that it is of top quality. That, as you know, there are 4 qualities of meat. There's prime, which is the best, and there's choice, which is the next best, and they're expensive. But if you get a steak from the shoulder, you have to be sure that it's tender. So you have to have the top quality, and then also it has to be aged. That means that it's been hung for a certain amount of time so that it's tender. And if you happen to be living in a sirloin steak neighborhood, you probably can get the best kind of arm steaks and other less expensive cuts, because they buy a lot of choice and prime quality steaks. I'm going to see if this is browned on one side. It only takes about 2 or 3 minutes. There, now that's just browned on that side, so it has to now brown on the other side. Now besides a thick steak 1.5 inches to 2 inches or over, this is an awfully good method to use if you have frozen steak that's, say, about 1 inch thick or thicker. You take it out about 2 hours before you're going to cook it and let the top of it just soften up a bit, and then dry it off and then brown it this way, and you'll find that it will cook much more easily in the oven, as we do later on. Now after it's browned on the other side, you then want to remove the oil that you've used, because it's probably going to be slightly burned. Besides, we're going to put some butter on it anyway. So there's your oil out, and then you want to have some flavoring on, some salt. I'm using some kosher or coarse salt, probably about a half teaspoonful, Then you can put a few herbs on. I'm putting on that mixture of Italian seasoning. Thyme would be very nice too. Just depends on what you like. And then a little bit of butter on the top. And that will baste it as it cooks. And then for even more flavor, you can put in some garlic clove. Just take the whole garlic clove and just lay it right in the pan. And then after that's cooked, the garlic will have softened up and you can mash it and you'll have a very nice garlic flavor. And then you want to, this will bake, this is now going to bake in the oven. And the easiest way to tell when it's done, it bakes for about 20 minutes. But if you want to be absolutely sure, you can use a meat thermometer. And here, 3 types of flat meat thermometers. This one just has a plain piece of glass, and this one has glass with a steel tip, and this one is steel all the way down. And this is a good type to use because it can't break off in the meat. And then you want to be sure that you put the thermometer in correctly. The point of it, say this is the top of the meat and that's the bottom, the point is supposed to go right in the middle. And so be sure you probably have to poke a little hole in the steak with a knife and then stick the thermometer in and be sure that the point is in the middle. Whether it comes actually in the center of this part of the meat doesn't make any difference as long as the point is between the center from the top and the bottom. But you don't have to have a thermometer, but I think it's a good thing to have because it takes a lot of the guesswork out of cooking. Then when you've got this all nicely browned, you're ready to bake it. And this goes into a 375-degree oven in the top third, and it'll bake just about 20 minutes. But you can also tell, if you don't have the thermometer, you can tell when it's done. I've got another one in here. You can tell when it's done by poking it. I'm going to take this out, and I also have a hot platter in here that the steak is going to go on. So I'll take that over here and then get to my steak. Now you can also, when the steak is done, this is a good thing to do, whether or not you have a thermometer, is to tell how it's done. You can tell by poking it with your finger. And if it still feels sort of squashy and raw, it's terribly rare. But when you get to about 130 degrees, which is medium rare, 130 degrees on your thermometer, you can feel when you poke it that there's just a slight resistance. And I think this is something that you should practice on, because you shouldn't have to rely on a thermometer. You should do as the professionals do, tell by just touching the steak. And now when the steak is done, out she goes onto the serving platter. I've got this serving platter lined with pomme duchesse, or mashed potatoes in a border. And now you have all of these nice cooking juices in the pan. And you have here your garlic, and you just press that down with a wooden spoon, and then take out the little garlic skins, and then you want to boil your juice down. And you have a very nice flavor because you have your herbs and everything. And if you need to have a little more juice, you can pour in some meat stock or a little bit of red wine, whatever you'd like, and this makes your sauce. And you want to boil this down until it gets practically syrupy. This is one of these tricks, or it isn't a trick at all actually, but it's the way of making a sauce that the French do a great deal, and that's one reason that steaks and things that are sautéed have such a nice sauce all of their own. Because they're always coagulated juices in the bottom of the pan, and you want to get them up by deglazing, that is putting in a little bit of liquid and then boiling it down, and you have what they call un petit jus, or just a little juice which is made out of the steak's own flavor and a little bit of extra. Then after that's boiled down and thickened, you want to put just a little bit of butter in. And this is sort of the final unctuousness of the sauce, and it also helps thicken the sauce a little bit, and you want to swish it around. And you never put it over heat after you've put your butter in. You see that butter is gradually absorbing and it's thickening the sauce just a little bit, and then pour it over your steak and you're ready to serve. And I think you'll find that this is a delicious way of doing steak, and it also, you don't smell up the kitchen with a lot of smoke and so forth. And it's really so easy, and I think everyone loves a thick steak, so I think that's a very nice system of doing it. And now, after we've done our thick steak, and this could be any kind of a steak, a sirloin or an arm or whichever one you wanted to do, we're now going to do a more expensive steak, and also a French way, a sauté, and we're going to use a steak from the loin. And that's your very expensive part. And I've got a whole loin here. I just wanted you to see what it looked like. I have it somewhat taken apart, but you can see the loin here. Here you are on the chart. This is it. It goes from the beginning of your hip bone up to your last or 13th rib, and you can locate that on yourself. It's right here. Here's where your rib ends, and there's where your hip is. And you see, it's this part right in here, and that's your loin. That's your very expensive section, and this is where your porterhouse steak comes from. If you look at this, you'll see that this looks like your porterhouse steak, and it is, because you have your square bone, the flat bone down at the bottom, which comes up through the meat and divides the meat into two pieces. You have this very large piece over here, and then you have a smaller piece here, and this smaller piece is the tenderloin. And the tenderloin runs all the way through the loin. It starts out large, and as it gets up to your rib end, it gets much smaller. See here, that's how it looks at the large end, which is near the hip, and then it just gets to a small little tail at the very end. And when this is cut up into steaks, if you cut it like that from this large end, that's called a Chateaubriand. That's a very expensive steak. And then as it comes down farther towards the tail, it's called a filet mignon. And these are terribly expensive when they're all boned out. And now we have the loin strip. That was that other part. And this is the same size on both ends. It's a big piece there, and it's a big piece there. And this is one of really the best steaks in the house. It has wonderful flavor, and this is terribly expensive too. And then here you end up with your bone. And this, we'll look at the chart here. Here's how it fits on the chart. You see, there's your rib, and there's your rib there, and then here's all the backbone, and it stops right there at the end of the hip. And then as you see, when you have your bones, this part here and the flat part there, that's why it's sometimes called a T-bone. So actually, no matter where you live or where you're moved to, if you can describe the kind of meat that you want, you can get what you want. And if you want to learn about it, I've picked up an awfully good booklet that's put out by the National Livestock and Meat Board. It's all illustrated with charts and pictures of the cuts. And you can get this by sending 50 cents to Lessons on Meat, Consumers Communications, National Livestock and Meat Board, 36 South Wabash Avenue, Chicago, Illinois, 60603. I think you'll find this very helpful with all the pictures and all the descriptions. So if you just send 50 cents to the National Livestock and Meat Board in Chicago, you'll get this book, and you'll sort of be well on the way to learning about meat. But as far as I can see, it's rather a life work. And now, our expensive steak, we're going to use a piece of this loin strip. And the loin strip is called by various names. Sometimes they call it a boneless sirloin or a Delmonico. But if you know that it is the large strip from the loin, that's what you'll get. And we're going to do steak au poivre, which is a famous French recipe of pepper steak. And there's crushed pepper, which is put on the steak, and then the steak is cooked. And you can use either white pepper like this or black peppercorns, and you want to break them up in something. And I found that the best way to break them up is to take some kind of a masher and just crush them like this, because you want to break them into pieces. It usually gets all over the kitchen. And then when you crush it up, and see, I haven't really crushed all of it quite the way it is. You see, it's in pieces. But you can also now, because this kind of pepper is very popular, you can get what's called cracked pepper. You see, that's a very coarse grind. So either grind it yourself or get the cracked pepper. And then you're going to put that on the steaks. But you first want to oil the steaks up a bit, because the oil acts like the oil in perfume. It carries the flavor of the pepper. And I'm just going to use, again, a light olive oil. And just rub it all over each side of the steaks. That's a little massage. That's always good for both steaks and people. And then you put your pepper on. And then crush it down with the palm of your hand. And then do the same thing on the other side. And how much pepper to use is something that's entirely up to you. If you can get a mixture of pepper called poivre aromatique, which is sort of a whole mixture of peppercorns, it's not quite as strong as plain pepper. But if you're going to do this, try it at home first so that you know how much pepper you like. But some people can take much more pepper than others. And then you're going to get the best flavor if you do this about 2 hours ahead and let the pepper flavor sink into the steaks. So I'll pretend that that's sat there for 2 hours, and the pepper is beautifully in the steaks, and then we're going to saute them. We're sauteing them in butter, but as usual, you saute them with a little bit of oil and then butter, because if you use just butter, the butter would burn, and the oil keeps it from, sort of supports it so it doesn't boil so quickly. And again, you want to be very careful that you have your oil hot, and you can always tell when it is hot when you're using butter by looking at the butter foam. The foam foams up the way it's doing now, and then gradually the foam begins to subside and the butter starts to brown. And just before it starts to brown, you put in your steaks. And you don't want to crowd the pan. You see, I can't get my fourth steak in here. If I would have to use 2 pans or a larger pan. But if you crowd the pan, you'll find that your steaks are not going to brown and saute. And what these are supposed to do is brown for just about a minute or two on one side, and then you turn them and brown them on the other side. And these steaks have only about ½ an inch thick. They're really minute steaks, and they cook very quickly. I must say they smell very good. That the combination of the butter and the pepper is delicious. Then you can make a sauce very much like the last sauce we made, or you can change it a little bit, or you can flambé them. And so we've already made that last sauce that we did. So I'm going to make a slightly thicker sauce. So I'm going to take the steaks out to another pan. You see, there's still some nice brown juices in there, and we want to add a little bit of chopped scallions or shallots, and then put in a little bit of bouillon. And if you want the sauce to be a little bit thickened, you could put in about a teaspoon of cornstarch and a little bit of wine. It's always nice to have wine in things, even if you're going to, say, flambe it with something else. And then take your pan off heat and pour that cornstarch and wine in. Of course, if you were a restaurant, you'd have a lovely brown sauce called a demi-glace. You see, that's thickened up quite a bit, and if it's thickened up too much, put in a little more wine or a little more bouillon. And then you taste it very carefully indeed. And if it needs salt and pepper or something else, you put that in. This is always very important. Don't ever make a sauce without tasting very carefully. Very nice. I think I'd put a little bit of salt in. Then as soon as your sauce is just the way you want it, you pour it right over your steaks. And then you can serve it this way, or you can flambe it, and that's what we're going to do. But if you're going to flambe anything, you want to be sure and heat up your pan, because we're going to flambe this in the dining room. And with flambeing, there are always these little tricks, which are heat, usually. So there is the pan, good and hot, and so in we go to the dining room. And I have a flaming device here, which I have somewhat invented myself. And it really works. See, I've got a great big heat source. You see that? And so on goes the pan. And I want to show you this. Now, this is the little sort of burner that this chafing dish came with, just a little wick, and it doesn't heat things up enough. So I've taken some of this alcohol paste and I've put it in a great big bowl. And so we've just got plenty of heat. And if you want to get this thing to flame, you want to put plenty of brandy in. I'm putting in about a third of a cup. And then this is so hot that this ought to just flame by itself. Some people go to the trouble of heating the brandy, and if you don't have much of a heat source, that's what you have to do. But as long as you've got this large heat source here, now look, see, it's flaming. I didn't even have to light that with a match. Isn't that wonderful? So that's what you can do if you have your great heat source and plenty of brandy that goes in, and then you want to have all the drama of spooning the sauce over the steaks. Be sure to stand fairly well away, because the flames are rather high and they can burn your eyelashes and hair, and have long spoons. And then I've always put things on a tray so I'm not going to burn the tablecloth. And then there's your steak on their plate, and then decorate it either, say, with potatoes or a little bit of watercress. That's always called vert pré. So that's all for today on The French Chef. This is Julia Child. Bon appétit.
Julia Child is co-author of the book Mastering the Art of French Cooking.